I'm honored to now introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, Natasha Hausdorff. Natasha is a sought-after keynote speaker on international law, foreign affairs, and national security policy, with a particular focus countering untrue narratives that have become widespread in current times. She regularly briefs politicians and international organizations and has spoken at parliaments across Europe and the United Nations. Natasha is a frequent contributor on legal matters for international media, including BBC, Sky News, CNN, GB News, Talk TV, and Fox. She has written for publications including The Telegraph and Sunday Telegraph, The Times, The Mail, and the Law Society Gazette. She holds law degrees from Oxford and Tel Aviv universities and was a fellow in the National Security Law Program at Columbia Law School in New York. Natasha previously worked for an American law firm, Skadden Arps, in London and Brussels, and had clerked for the president of the Israeli Supreme Court, Chief Justice Miriam Noir, in Jerusalem, and further serves as a legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel and Charitable Trust. Please help me welcome Natasha Hausdorff. Sorry. This is for you, Natasha. Thank you.
Thank you.
How are we doing with the mics? We're good?
Spot on.
So I have the best job in the world, don't I? Getting to work with these students, these are stories that we're hearing every day. Sydney, as much as she is outstanding and award-worthy, we have 103 of them across the country like her. But the other reason why I love my job is because I get to bring people like you to speak to our communities. We have so many speakers coming to Canada, and I'm sure everywhere else around the world right now. You cannot guess how many people have come up to me tonight, last night. What a find. What a get. Natasha, she's the best. So welcome to Toronto.
Thank you so much. I'm absolutely honored and humbled to be here. And I have to say, particularly moved to be a part of this evening. Having the opportunity to, again, experience Nova exhibit, but in an evolved, in an expanded, and in some respects a reimagined form, has been truly, truly moving. To hear testimony from On and the incredibly moving words, Idit, Shamir, that you shared this evening, it brings everything once more to life and to the fore. And Sydney, what an inspiration you are. I know that you mentioned your own family connection, and I know that we are all so glad that Omi has returned. But what your words indicated to me, or reminded me of, was the family connection that I think I felt, and I'm sure everyone here felt, with every single one of those hostages and those victims at Nova and across the south of Israel on the 7th of October. It brought the Jewish community around the world together. It unified us as one family. We may be the smallest people in the world, but we are the biggest family, and that was never more powerfully felt than on that tragic day and the 19 months thereafter. So thank you, all of you, for reminding us of that in your own particular ways, and it reinforces for me that each and every one of us have our own role here. Our own role to bear witness, to push back against the falsehoods, to advocate, to stand up, to be strong, and to set an example for the rest of the Jewish community, to follow in those footsteps, and to inspire our allies from other communities to speak up for the truth and for justice, and of course, in terms of my favorite subject, the proper application of international law. But I'm thrilled that on an evening like this, we can bring all of those strands together and hopefully collectively learn from each other and take strength and confidence from the fact that we are not alone in this fight.
So we're not alone, but it certainly is a fight. And I think, students like Sydney have felt it more than anyone. And so I'd love to start there, just on that note of, you've had an incredibly storied legal career. You were a Pegasus scholar at the Columbia Law School. You clerked for the president of the Supreme Court of Israel. It's an astonishing resume, but it's also a very relevant resume, I think, because of your time at Columbia, right? Columbia has become the front line of anti-Semitic hatred, of violent rhetoric. You were there in 2018, I believe. Could you have seen this coming at the time? Was Columbia showing signs of what was to come? And what do you think we can and should be looking out for on our other campuses that have reached not quite yet the peak that we've seen at Columbia?
So my experience, excuse me, in 2018, I was a fellow at Columbia Law School, so I spent quite a bit of time in the faculty lounge. And I think one of my major takeaways was that the hostility I encountered was not just bottom up. This was not just coming from the students. This was top down. This was coming from members of the faculty, especially in the international legal arena. The International Legal Academy was captured a long time ago. If you have not drunk the Kool-Aid on Israel, you are not going to progress as an academic. You are not going to get assistant professorships. You're not going to get tenure. So that in and of itself was pretty palpable. But what I have to say in looking at where Columbia and of course other universities across North America and across the world have shifted to, I'd say I wasn't surprised by the sentiment, but I began to deconstruct some of the reasons why we had seen this bizarre state of affairs where students who have grown up in Western liberal democracies with all of the privileges of living in this part of the world, the freedoms, decided to ally themselves with terrorist organizations and fly the flags of Hamas and Hezbollah. And it struck me that ultimately it came down to an absence of purpose, and that this presented them with an opportunity to camp out and to feel as though they were part of something. Yes, it had absolutely been built upon and predicated on all of the lies that they had been taught, to be ashamed of the culture from which they had come, to be ashamed of the traditions of Canada, America, the United Kingdom, European states, of the benefits that they had been born with, and to project those imagined ills onto the Jewish state. And it struck me that that absence of purpose, frankly, was on us as the slightly older generations. Because when I started this journey of mine about 25 years ago, it's when I found my purpose. I was 11, and I ended up at a great high school that was extremely anti-Israel. It was part of the intellectual liberal elite. And I found my purpose to start with in arguing with my teachers and pushing back on the false notions that they were peddling in the classroom. Because I knew better. I'd been to Israel. I'd read the news. I'd experienced so much of what they were talking about from afar. And I'm extremely grateful and privileged to have had that purpose for the last 25 years. And that's what I see students at Stand With Us have enjoyed also. I was extremely privileged to speak at the conference in Los Angeles, 650 students from around the world, and not all of them came from environments where there was a strong Jewish community. Many of them were at their universities fighting this fight, feeling like they were the only ones, the only Zionists around. To see their faces, to see the transformation in them when they came together with like-minded students from around the world and realized that they were not alone, that was extremely powerful. And it resonated for me because it echoed my own experience. I very much grew up thinking that there were 3 other Zionists in the whole of the UK, my parents and my sister. I was delighted when I came to university and I realized I was mistaken. But that realization for me was extremely powerful. That sense of purpose for me was extremely powerful. That is what I see Stand With Us giving these students. That is what I see is lacking in these students who have been hijacked and hoodwinked and brainwashed to support terror and a fight against the West. But we have a platform and a pathway through this, I think, through the incredible work that Stand With Us and other organizations like it are doing.
I think the work we're doing is important, and you've talked about this as a fight you've been having for 25 years. The fight is, we can only go as far as people will listen, right? When we had the encampment set up here, there was a real tendency where if anyone from our side of the conversation tried to approach in a friendly way, non-confrontational, there would be a wall built to prevent the people who you were talking to from continuing that conversation. I'm sure that the vast majority of people here saw what happened to you last week on Piers Morgan and the absolute, as you called it, circus that took place. I want to read a quote quickly. You said that you thought in your brilliant piece for The Spectator, which I suggest you read if you haven't yet, you called it a refusal, perhaps even a fear, to hear the reality, the facts, and the law when it comes to the war against Hamas. Our students feel this every day. Can you expand a little bit on what you meant when you said that and how you feel like that presents itself in our world today?
Well, in that particular context, not allowing me to answer the barrage of questions that were coming my way did strike me as, look, of course, it's part of a particular style and approach, which I do consider to have become a circus. But it was indicative to me of something deeper because it wasn't the first time. And ultimately, whenever I have been interviewed on BBC, Sky, and others, there is almost a meltdown at what it is that I'm saying, because it is so at odds with the agenda that these media institutions are peddling. And to me, first of all, it means it's ever so much more important that I stick to this and keep expressing the realities of the situation, the proper application of law, and talk about my own experiences. I mean, I echo again, I have been extremely privileged with the opportunities that I have had, especially over the last 19 months. I went into Gaza in September last year with a military expert panel of generals, colonels, majors from 6 NATO countries. And we went into Rafah along the Philadelphia corridor. We saw some of the challenges that the IDF was experiencing. The tunnels under the border with Gaza, which are extraordinary. Some of them were big enough for 2 lanes of traffic, right under Egyptian command towers. So having these insights, it's so important, I feel, to be speaking up and to be challenging it. But armed with these facts, what I am saying is so contrary to not just the received wisdom, but all of the media coverage, certainly over the last 19 months, but extending many, many years before that, which is just regurgitating Hamas propaganda. Nothing that is reported out of the Gaza Strip is reported without the control and the stamp of approval of Hamas. And frankly, the international media are complicit in parroting this Hamas propaganda and in snuffing out the realities of the situation. And so when I bring them out, there's a general kind of system error and an inability to be able to properly confront and deal with them. Because frankly, and this is the comfort and the optimism that I do take out of this, I do believe that the truth will out. I do believe that the facts ultimately will be vindicated. It's just a long process. And I'm extremely grateful for the support from all of you and many others around the world to continue to do so. I hope that I can inspire others to pick up that baton, to use this ammunition, to study the facts, and to collectively push back. Because I think when these anchors, media presenters, journalists hear the truth for multiple quarters, that system error may even evolve into an acknowledgement of the harm that they have done, certainly over the last 19 months, in providing succor to Hamas, in supporting these terrorists with their genocidal agenda, in dragging out this conflict, perpetuating, prolonging the conflict, costing lives on the Palestinian and Israeli side. This is what the international media are responsible for. It has led to unbelievably damaging statements from the UK, Canada and France most recently, statements that provide succor to Hamas and that unfortunately elongate the conflict. Ultimately, it's all arising from the very point that you've picked up on in your question, the refusal to even engage with the reality and the facts.
And I think it's not just the mainstream media, right? We have the same issue that we're facing on social media every day. These social media companies, platforms, Facebook, Meta, whatever they call themselves now, have no issue with their community guidelines as it relates to commentary against the Jewish community, against Israel. Having said that, we don't see nearly on the same amount of content on TikTok, for example, that is pro-Israel versus pro-Palestinian. But the biggest thing right now is we're seeing AI, we're seeing deep fakes, we're seeing videos that don't exist of soldiers talking about how much they love killing children. There's a lot going on right now. You're talking about it in the mainstream media and everywhere else that I just mentioned. We also talked today earlier about the fact that even in our courts, we're not seeing judges looking at the facts as they should be, evaluating them. So where do you see the battle for truth playing out as we try to reclaim our narrative, as we try to prevent history from being rewritten in front of our eyes? Where do you see that playing out, and how do people like you and people like us make our voices heard in that battle?
So social media is as a whole nother battlefield, and of course the numbers are very much against us. I've always been a big believer in quality over quantity, though, and I know I see a lot of quality out there in this room this evening, and I know that a lot of you are already doing an awful lot of important work on Twitter, on Instagram, and StandWithUs is doing a remarkable job on that front too. What I would say, and perhaps coming back to the laws of armed conflict in this context, the realities of what international law says, especially international humanitarian law, the laws of war, are recognized by experts. You've got military experts like John Spencer, like Colonel Richard Kemp. You've got some legal experts that are speaking out. You have the expert military panel that I went into Gaza with, who came back and did start writing op-eds about their experiences. They had never seen rules of engagement like this. The level of commitment of Israel to prevent civilian casualties in the Gaza Strip was simply unparalleled. You have Colonel Richard Kemp, who's repeatedly given evidence, including at the United Nations on this point, calls the IDF the most moral army in the history of warfare. I mean, why is that? Because no other army takes the measures that Israel takes in upholding the principles of international humanitarian law: necessity, distinction, proportionality, and precaution. But the fact that you have experts that are willing to speak up on this basis, and not just call out the misinformation, but also call out the danger that this misinformation is driving by saying, if you are misrepresenting what Israel is doing in Gaza, you, Canada, are going to struggle the next time you're facing genocidal terrorists on the battlefield. The same with the US, the same with the UK. If you start morphing the acceptable framework of how to conduct warfare morally and legally, it's going to have a much broader, wider impact on the ability of Western civilization as a whole to defend itself. And I think that the fact that you have experts like these individuals I mentioned that are willing to speak out on it speaks volumes. I think that provides a great deal of ammunition to many people to be able to turn the tide. You've raised, international courts and tribunals, which frankly is a dire situation where we're seeing the politicization of courts like the ICC, like the ICJ. But let's not forget the brave voices that are speaking out against this, including the Vice President of the International Court of Justice, Julia Sebutinde, the Ugandan judge. Every single one of her dissenting opinions and her dissent to the preliminary orders of the ICJ in the South Africa case, they have called the court out consistently for its misapplication of international law, for its appalling approach to fact-finding, for its politicization of these issues. And I think as long as we have individuals and very strong voices speaking out across all of these issues, then there is hope and there is leadership and something for the rest of us to be able to follow.
And so I want to go back a few minutes to this letter that we talked about that was signed by Canada, France, and the UK. What was your initial reaction to that, and how do we as Canadians reconcile this notion that our government does not seem to, it's one thing to not stand with us, but to also to not seem to understand that by signing a letter of this nature, that they're effectively condoning terrorism, they're rewarding terrorism, they're standing against the only democracy in the Middle East. How do we reconcile those things as Canadians and continue to feel comfortable in a country like this?
These are big questions, Jesse. Wow. So my initial reaction, apart from here we go again, was to be deeply concerned on two levels. One, as you rightly identify, the fact that this is encouraging Hamas. And let's not forget, Antony Blinken was extremely honest towards the end of the last American administration when he acknowledged every time there was daylight between the US and Israel, Hamas left the negotiating table. These hostages spent longer in Gaza, and the 53 that are remaining there are a direct result of the encouragement to Hamas that this letter, amongst other things, provides for them to continue, for them to leave negotiations and hold out for something better, including, they think, their survival. Let me be clear. If Hamas survives, the war is not over. Israel has been repeatedly clear about its war aims, returning the hostages, defeating Hamas, ensuring they can never present the threat that they did on the 7th of October. So quite apart from that inevitable consequence of deeply irresponsible statements like the one contained in this joint letter, I was also desperately concerned for the Jewish communities around the world, because what happened on the streets of DC with the execution of Yaron and Sarah by someone shouting "Free Palestine" and "This is for Gaza," what happened in Boulder, that is directly linked to deeply irresponsible statements like this. It's also linked to complete falsehoods propagated by Tom Fletcher and the international media of 14,000 babies dying in 48 hours. I mean, that is an absurdity that should have collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity, and yet it was repeated by the media around the world. So those are the two deep concerns I had in terms of the consequences, the impact on the suffering in Gaza and in Israel, and the impact on the Jewish community and its security around the world. But it was very interesting to me that this letter was again predicated on this canard of starvation. Israel is starving civilians in Gaza. I cannot believe that with the joint resources of the US, Canada, the UK, Canada, and France, not a single member of any of those administrations could look up the COGAT website, on which they have chronicled the volume of aid that Israel has facilitated into the Gaza Strip for the last 19 months. This has also been subject to independent analysis by experts that haven't just looked at the over 1,700,000 tons of aid that has been facilitated in. They also looked at the calorific content of that aid. And in this study that was published that covered January to June last year, it was established that in terms of calorific content, over 3,000 calories per Gazan per day had been facilitated into the Gaza Strip over this period. Where is that being taken into account? I understand that the national health guidelines here in Canada are something like 2,000 calories per meal, less for women and children. Where is this food going if we are being told that there are shortages in Gaza? Likewise, with this canard of starvation on the basis of the blockade on aid post the collapse of the ceasefire, where are we hearing the context of that, including that over the course of the hostage release deal, over 25,000 trucks were facilitated into Gaza, flooding Gaza with aid? All of the estimates I have seen is that that would be sufficient for between 5 to 6 months of humanitarian assistance in the Gaza Strip, some as high as 8. And according to UK Lawyers for Israel's back-of-the-envelope figures, that checks out. We've recently tweeted a breakdown of our calculations. This is unfathomable to me. If there is a report of shortages in Gaza, the question that Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, UN organizations, Save the Children, and every other aid organization present there should be asking is, where has this aid gone? And the absolute cherry on this appalling cake is the manner in which we have seen a response to the true initiative of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to provide, this is an initiative by Israel and the US or US contractors, to provide humanitarian assistance in Gaza that is not diverted to Hamas. Immediately, we saw aid organizations telling Gazans not to accept aid, criticizing this initiative in public, demonstrating loud and clear to me and everyone else that their interest is in propping up Hamas. The only possible explanation of opposition to a mechanism of delivering aid that prevents diversion to Hamas is that these organizations are opposed to that. That is the true diabolical reality that we are witnessing, and it checks out when you think about the cycle of disinformation that we are witnessing. I went through the Amnesty International report alleging genocide in Gaza. I looked at the methodology of this report. They name their sources. They don't have a presence on the ground. They rely on local authorities in Gaza. Who is that, ladies and gentlemen? Hamas. So they take this Hamas propaganda, they put it in a document headed up Amnesty International. That then gets quoted by UN special rapporteurs, you know who. That in turn gets quoted by UN resolutions in the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly, which in turn get referred to in the ICJ or the ICC. And then the cycle is complete when these NGOs report what the ICC or the ICJ found or relied upon that came from their original report on Hamas propaganda. And that disinformation cycle also sits at the heart of these problematic statements. So you have the media, you have international organizations, you have the UN, and you have the dire consequences of these statements. And your question ultimately was, what do we do about it? We fight that on every corner. The disinformation, the misinformation, we call it out. Because when I was just in Oslo and Copenhagen calling Amnesty International out on this recently, they did not have answers. Ultimately, it was apparent to me they hadn't even read their own report, the representatives who came to defend it. But that is the critical aspect of this, calling them out, holding them to account, and not letting the lies go unanswered.
Now, I don't mean to be, pessimistic, but as a small follow-up to that question, do you feel like at this point the systems, like we've talked about the ICJ, the UN Human Rights Council, do you feel like these systems are rigged against us in a way that makes it? I mean, they are. Fighting back is one thing, but what can we do? Is there something systematically, a real change we can try to make to fix this problem, or are we going to have to just raise our voices until something changes?
So I think it's deeply shameful that the only country that is seeking to hold the ICC to account is in fact a non-member state, the United States. And it's doing so through a particularly blunt instrument by sanctioning the prosecutor and several of the judges. But the responsibility on member states of that court to hold it to account in light of its complete its operation completely outside of its own jurisdiction. Jurisdiction has been thrown out of the window. And this is critical because the only thing that differentiates a political body from a legal one is jurisdiction. The court has no jurisdiction here. Israel is not a party. The Palestinians are not a state. They cannot join the court. And even thereafter, there are many, many reasons that there are problems with jurisdiction, which we cover on UKLFI material. I invite you to investigate. It's also a breach of the court's own rules, and the information that the court relied upon in issuing these warrants is completely false. We've done a detailed analysis at UKLFI on the public statement supporting the arrest warrants, which determined that every phrase of every sentence of that document was false. And we did so on the basis of publicly available material. So I think that calling out these legal institutions for failing to live up to their mandate is critical. I also think it's important that we understand why these things are happening and why it is that the ICC would be launching into an area in which they have no jurisdiction on the basis of false information and in breach of their own rules. And in that context, I mean, the ICC itself has come under deep criticism. In its first 10 years of operation, it achieved one successful conviction at a cost of nearly $1 billion. It was then resoundingly criticized for going after mainly African defendants. And so, what better way of seeking to rehabilitate yourself than by going after the world's punching bag, the only Jewish state, and the leaders thereof? So, calling out the motivations as well as the acts of these institutions is critical. And with respect to the ICJ, I mean, the former president of the court, who just left his post to become Lebanon's prime minister, whose track record was perfectly clear. If anyone listened to what he'd said as Lebanon's ambassador to the UN, and this was brilliantly documented by Hillel Neuer at UN Watch, calling Israel a terror state, accusing it of war crimes, in any real court, a judge like that would be required to recuse himself. But he was the president that, by all accounts, pushed the cases against Israel to the top of the docket. Calling out these institutions for this malpractice has to ultimately be heard and be listened to. I do think that reasonable people will be open to this, and I think that there are potentially two messages that will resonate outside of the committed people in this room. The first is that you have been lied to. You've had the wool pulled over your eyes. When you are shown images purporting to be of starving children in Gaza, or children that Israel has starved in Gaza, look at the well-fed mothers sitting next to them. I've never encountered a mother who would eat before her starving child. Why is nobody asking these questions? That is what I would like to know. One of them had a double chin. The fact that Hamas, I mean, it is so tragic that, I mean, if you don't laugh, you'll cry. The fact that Hamas is manipulating what are clearly very sick children for the purpose of propagating its propaganda against Israel and is being assisted in this process by the international community, that is part and parcel of this first message: you have been lied to. And the second message that I hope will resonate outside of this room is: you think this is Israel's problem? Think again. What starts with the Jews does not end with the Jews. They want to begin with Israel, but they are coming after the West next. And in fact, when Douglas and I were on the Save the West tour throughout the United States, that was the resounding message that we need to wake up, we need to take this seriously, because it's Western civilization that is at stake.
And so I want to actually... I know this is going to sound wild, but it's like we talk about anti-Semitism and everything's kind of like, oh, it's anti-Semitic, they're anti-Semitic, but you don't stop to think about the conscious decisions that go into saying, how can we rehabilitate our image? We need to find a scapegoat, and how it still somehow is always us, right? And that now what's happened is, like you said, they've scapegoated us and turned us into the pariah, not just for the Jewish community, but for the entirety of the West. And so I want to stay on the ICJ for one more question. How has the rise of globalism and our dependency on organizations like the UN, which has no real legal implications, the ICJ, the ICC, how has that allowed anti-Semitism to flourish? How is our reliability on these global organizations and their word being considered holier than anything else? How has that led us here?
And Amnesty International and co, who are sacred in many parts of the world. No, it's a very good question. I think there are two things I would raise. The first is the sort of long-standing war that exists between rule of law countries and non-rule of law countries. So rule of law countries like Canada, the US, the UK, Israel, view law as a curtailment on government power, whereas the despots and the dictatorships around the world view law as a means of wielding power. And that tension has existed for decades. I mean, you see it in the negotiations over Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. I'm talking about going back to the 70s. You see this concerted attempt to manipulate international law to be able to use it as cover for terror proxies. And you see the way that the West has acquiesced in that process, has allowed itself to be manipulated, hasn't stood up, hasn't fought back, the way that rule of law countries are being ridden over roughshod in this process. So I think that's one key aspect of the phenomenon, identifying it. But I would also stress that in pushing back against these misrepresentations, we're finding ourselves in a situation where the misinformation at a kind of very basic. Well, I'd say I put it even in these terms. The impact, and we talked about this a little bit earlier in terms of the legal academy and we talked about the impact at universities of encampments. And I referenced the fact that when I was at Columbia, it was top down, not just bottom up. That's a really important factor when we come on to think about the development of international law. When I was at Columbia, Sarah Cleveland was a member of faculty there. She's now the ICJ judge for the US, right? I audited some of her lectures. The political agenda was palpable. I've read her separate opinions now while she's a judge at the ICJ. Her political agenda, frankly, I consider to be palpable. And that symbiotic relationship of the academy and legal practice and the back and forth between academics and judges and other practitioners in international legal affairs is part and parcel. It's just another important aspect to highlight, in addition to the media, in addition to the international organizations here. Academics are playing a significant role also.
I want to move on from these global courts and this topic, and I want to pivot a little bit to more of a bit of a personal question, but something that I hope the experiences you've had will help inform some of what we're going to deal with ourselves in the next, however many months or years. This past May, a number of British lawyers signed a letter calling on the UK government to cease arms trades with Israel, to stop sending arms to Israel. As a lawyer in the UK, I'm not going to ask you how that makes you feel as it relates to being isolated amongst your own profession. But what I would say is that I know there are people in this room who have had that question they've had to ask, right? Of, is my career worth jeopardizing to speak up for something, or should I let it go? And unfortunately, this has been, and I'll say it myself, what I think to be the Achilles heel of the Jewish community for generations and generations is trying not to be too problematic to have somebody get mad at us and, try to look for any reason to.
Because then they'll really hate us.
Right. So I don't stand for that, but I know that it's difficult for many people. You build a career for decades. How do you risk throwing it away?
I hope I haven't done that.
Not saying you.
Yes, listen, I fully appreciate I'm in a very privileged position in another respect. During the 2014 war, Tzuk Protective Edge, I was working at a big law firm. I was at Skadden Arps. I was very restricted in what I was able to say. You cannot, when you are part of a big machine like that and you're a small cog, make noise. I moved to the bar after my time in Israel. And as an independent practitioner, I have a great deal more flexibility. I am my own boss. I therefore feel an added responsibility to speak out and speak up on these issues because I know that not everyone is in a position to do so. And what I would say is if you are not able to speak publicly, there are other ways in which you can contribute. I have been a member of the voluntary association, UK Lawyers for Israel, which is how it began. For over a decade, working with students, pushing back on BDS resolutions at local authority level, helping people in the workplace who are discriminated against. And if you're not a lawyer, in every single way, in everyone's own bubble, industry, arena, there are ways that you can contribute. And it will take all of us. This eighth front that we are dealing with, we hear a great deal about Israel's kinetic war on the 7 fronts. This eighth front is our battle, and it's inextricably linked with the other 7, because when I hear friends of mine talking about their experiences in Gaza and I ask, how's the war going? And they say, not bad, considering we're fighting with both hands tied behind our back. I ask myself, why is that the case? It's because of what's happening on this 8th front. That, ladies and gentlemen, I consider to be our responsibility. But I hear what you say about the legal arena and the legal profession in particular. I just want to pick up on this letter, because it's not the first one of its nature. And in fact, we have a response to it. There was also, of course, last year, a first letter. It got something like 800 signatures, and I said immediately, we have to respond. I had no notion that we would get anywhere close to 800. We got 1,400 lawyers and retired judges to sign on to our letter. So there are people, even within the legal profession in the UK, willing to speak up. But the reason that it was so important that there was support for this letter of response is because of the abject falsehoods that were contained in that first letter that have been echoed in this recent letter which we're responding to. And they included blatant misrepresentations of what the International Court of Justice had held. This was a letter that was written in response, supposedly, to the first provisional measures order of the ICJ. Does everyone remember how this was reported? That Israel had been plausibly found guilty of genocide, or that there was a plausible risk of genocide? That wasn't true. And anyone just needed to read the order. It was only 24 pages. And the idea that any lawyer would have signed on to this without having read the order and drawn their own conclusions is baffling to me. But it wasn't just lawyers. It was also former judges of the Supreme Court in the UK, Baroness Hale and Lord Jonathan Sumption. And when I gave evidence in the House of Commons, in the International Trade Committee, unfortunately against Jonathan Sumption. I mean, he was referred to by the Evening Standard as Britain's biggest brain. So this was not an encounter that I took lightly, but, you know, the order says what the order says. And I explained my position on what the order said. He called it unarguable. Less than 30 hours later, the former president of the ICJ, Joan Donoghue, came out on Hard Talk on the BBC and vindicated every single word of ours. Every single word I said in the committee, every single word we said in the letter of response. They had been talking about plausible rights. They'd made no assessment of the merits, no assessment of Israel's case. Plausible rights simply assesses whether the rights South Africa was claiming on behalf of the Palestinians fell under the Genocide Convention. But that's not what you heard in the international media, and that's not what these lawyers signed on to. So what I would say to any lawyers out there worried about going against the grain on this is that just because there are senior members of your profession saying that Israel is violating international law and saying that there are consequences that need to stem from that, doesn't mean that they are right. They are following a fashion, they are going with the herd, they are applying this received wisdom, and I deeply believe the responsibility is on all of us to call them out. What motivates them? I mean, we can have a separate conversation about that, but the ultimate fact of the matter is that they are wrong about this. They are being proven wrong time and time again. And that, I hope, is sufficient for anyone who cares about law, justice, truth, to feel that additional degree of confidence in standing up for those important values.
She's amazing. Amazing. Because it's, you know what, like these are things that unfortunately the vast majority of us don't have access to. I mean, it's sad to say, but we're not going to read these legal findings ourselves in many cases, though we should. The media is not going to report them to us.
I would just advocate the UKLFI website because we summarize an awful lot of this on there. So if anyone does want to engage with this material, there's a lot to be found on UK Lawyers for Israel and the Charitable Trust website. A little plug, sorry.
Plug away. I heard a little applause. I thought there might be more, but it's okay. I think for a lot of us, you know, it's hard when somebody says, well, look, the courts are saying there's a plausible risk of genocide taking place in Gaza. Even if we, we're cognitively aware of the fact that that wasn't the case, it's hard to argue back. And I think you being here to illuminate that to us, it really does make it clear enough to say to somebody, oh no, that's not what happened, right? And the average person in this room, I would bet that was news to them. And so I'd like to kind of go further down that road a little bit and talk about the weaponization of law, lawfare as we call it. You know, I'll give you carte blanche to sort of talk about anything you'd like as it relates to what else the world has missed, what has been completely misrepresented in the court of world opinion, of opinion rather than of law. What particular words, buzzwords that we're hearing can you help us to argue against, like you just did?
So you're giving me carte blanche, but you know exactly what I'm going to be saying. Has anyone heard of the term uti possidetis juris? I'm so grateful that a gentleman earlier today presented me with a T-shirt with those words on it, uti possidetis juris. I don't know where you are, sir, but you're a legend. Great, thank you. Round of applause. So I use this as an example, but it's critical because it puts the lie to so much of what people are accusing Israel of in terms of breaching international law and what you hear about illegal occupation and illegal settlements. Uti possidetis juris is a universal rule of customary international law that tells us what the borders of states are when they come into existence. It emerged in the 19th century with the withdrawal of the Spanish from South America. So this is a rule that meant to provide stability and certainty and to prevent fratricidal struggles. That is what the International Court of Justice talked about when it talked about the emergence of this rule. And its application to Israel is clear in that it dictates that the new state, at the critical date, the moment of independence, which was the 14th of May 1948, Israel inherits the pre-existing administrative lines that preceded it as its international borders. Now, those lines of the British Mandate ran down along the Jordan River to the Red Sea. I know we have representatives of the State of Israel with us today, and many people say to me, but Israel doesn't make this claim. And so this is really important to understand. Israel doesn't have to. There may be all sorts of political, diplomatic reasons that shape Israel's public statements on this topic. They're frankly important for their purpose, but for the application of this rule, they're irrelevant. This is a universal rule that applies as a default wherever there is no agreement to the contrary. And since the 14th of May 1948, there has never been an agreement to displace the application of this rule. Borders have always been considered to be a final status negotiation issue. But I say you cannot have a hope of negotiations that are fruitful if they are predicated on a false application of international law or a falsification of the historical narrative. You have to be honest about the facts and the law if these negotiations are going to have a hope of success. So what does it mean for Israel? That from 1949 to 1967, between Israel's War of Independence and the 1967 war, that territory on the eastern side, East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank as it became known in that period, was occupied by Jordan. And in 1967, Israel recovered that territory. What did it do? It applied its law, administration, and jurisdiction in full to East Jerusalem. It said it was reuniting the city, never to be divided again. And Abba Eban, who was the foreign minister of Israel at the time, writes to the UN Secretary General and says to him, this is not annexation, because you cannot annex what is your own sovereign territory. What Israel does in Judea and Samaria is it implements a temporary administrative framework. It doesn't apply its law, administration, and jurisdiction in full. It has underlying sovereignty, but that temporary framework was instituted because of an expectation under the Land for Peace formula that peace with Jordan would be achieved by giving Jordan some of the West Bank. But when peace with Jordan finally came around in 1994, Jordan didn't want anything to do with that territory. So instead, the Oslo Accords created the Palestinian autonomy in areas A and B of the West Bank. Again, a temporary framework, and we're still waiting to work out where these negotiations will go. But that is the application of international law. And there are parallels here to other big topics in the current debate that I think are important to highlight. What one in particular is in relation to Ukraine. Its borders followed uti possidetis juris. That is why there is a consensus that Russia has occupied Crimea from Ukraine. But if Ukraine were to recover Crimea from Russia in this war, in the same way that Israel recovered East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria from Jordan in 1967, does anyone here really think that people would accuse Ukraine of occupying Crimea? Maybe Russia, but that might be it. So this palpable, it's not just a double standard, it is a total inversion of international law. And let's not forget, this is a rule that was established to prevent fratricidal struggles, to provide stability, to provide certainty, everything that its disapplication here for no good reason has generated. Now, you cannot have a general rule and an exception for a country you don't like very much, or you have some political or ideological opposition to. That is not how any respectable legal system can operate. So we come back to this harm that it is doing to international rule of law more broadly. But this analysis, this proper application of international law, puts the lie to occupation. You cannot occupy what is your own sovereign territory. It puts the lie to illegal settlements, which is predicated on calling this land occupied, but also involves other misstatements of international law, including the wrong application of Article 49.6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. But all of this is in aid of insisting on a position of the ethnic cleansing of these parts of the world of Jews, of making them Judenrein. That is what the International Court of Justice called for last year in its advisory opinion, when it called for the ethnic cleansing of Jews from East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. That is unacceptable on every basic moral level. The position that Jews should not live in certain areas simply because they are Jews is what is being advocated by the international community through this misapplication of international law. And the fact that this is the general consensus, that peace will only be achieved once the rest of the land is cleansed of its Jews, as Gaza was cleansed of its Jews in 2005. The only Jews in Gaza are those 53 hostages still being kept by Hamas. That areas A and B have been cleansed of their Jews. Has anyone gone to the West Bank? Has anyone seen those big red signs that warn Israelis from going into Palestinian-controlled territory? They say Israelis. They don't actually mean that, because Israeli Arabs have no difficulty going backwards and forwards. They mean Jews, because we know what happens to Jews. 2 of them who found themselves in Ramallah in 2000 and were lynched when they went for help in a local police station. That is what happens when territory is cleansed of Jews. And coming back to what is bringing us all together this evening and the atrocities of the 7th of October, the thousands of terrorists that crossed the border on the 7th and committed their rampage of rape and slaughter and mutilation and burning and kidnap, many of them had never seen a Jew before, because they had grown up in an area that had been ethnically cleansed of them. Many that are interviewed in these parts of the world, they talk about Jews as having horns and tails. And the first Jews that they encountered in their lives, many of these young Palestinians, were the Jews that they subjected to these barbaric atrocities. That should be a lesson to us as to what the ethnic cleansing of Jews breeds. It breeds hatred. It breeds terrorism. And if we are going to be honest about the drivers of this conflict, indoctrination to terror, incentivization to terror, that is what the international community needs to commit itself to countering. That is the only way that we're going to be able to build a positive, peaceful future on the basis of the correct application of international law, including uti possidetis juris.
So I'm wondering, do you think that is the path? Like, we've talked a lot tonight about what can we do, how do we fix this, how do we change this rigged system against us? Do you think, as we talk about, the idea of globalizing the Intifada, right? We see what's going on right now in Los Angeles, that this protest that started about immigration has all of a sudden become a protest against Israel, that there's keffiyehs and Palestinian flags, and the rule of law, as you talked about, is disappearing before our eyes, right? Do you think that's what pushes the everyday, what we like to think is the 80%, maybe 70 now, maybe 60, that are what we say, like, in the middle on this subject? Do you think that's what pushes them further towards us and away from this idea of allowing anti-Semitism to fester, because they see, like, it's, once they come for the Saturday people, it's the Sunday people next? Do you think the West will wake up soon enough and quickly enough to prevent this intifada from continuing, not just against the Jews, but against people all over the West?
Oh my goodness, I hope so. And not just for the sake of the Jews in Israel, but for their own sakes, because of exactly what you say, that they are going to be next. I am frequently reassured. I'm not sure how reassuring I find it, but people seek to reassure me that the silent majority is with us. The problem is that they're silent. I hope that that's the case, and I hope that the arguments that we have been addressing, and I know the arguments that many people here are making on a regular basis, resonate with the silent majority, with the reasonable people. I hope that the extreme behavior and the crazed mentality or approach of many people that they exhibit when they go on these marches and they call for the genocide of Jews. I hope that that does, perhaps in the way that the Piers Morgan interview backfired on him, I hope that that does, show their true selves and indicate to reasonable people what the side of light and what the side of darkness here really is. But then it's tricky because the flip side of that is the barrage and avalanche of misinformation that they are being subject to on a regular basis. And if you were an average, reasonable person in the UK, then why wouldn't you believe what the BBC is telling you? Or here in Canada, why wouldn't you believe what CBC is telling you? It's interesting, actually. About a year ago, CBC did actually reach out to me for an interview. And I said, very happy to, live, or if it's pre-recorded, without edits, or please run the edits past me. And they said no. So that was the end of that. But, remarkable, I thought, that that I should be expected to, put complex information out there and allow it to be potentially edited and taken out of context and misrepresented. But again, that was a further indication of what it is that we're grappling with in terms of supposedly respectable media across the world. That's, I think, something that we really do need to take into consideration, that even reasonable people, intelligent, activated, well-read, decent human beings are being subject to this sort of misinformation. So maybe you'll tell me don't hold it against them. But again, I'm coming back to the same theme here. It's on us to educate these people as much as possible and to hope that, especially through the manner in which the situation is hotting up on our streets, through the extreme and tragic consequences that we are witnessing, that people will ultimately have the wool pulled away from their eyes.
I want to actually keep it here in Canada for a split second and talk about how difficult it's been for us. The latest blow, I think, for the Jewish community here was Israel issuing a travel warning to Canada.
Just before I came.
We've got lots of security around, and unfortunately, that's become our reality. Right? The reality has become that we can't release the locations of our events until 2 days before. We have to have more security than we've ever had in our lives. All of our synagogues are renovating their buildings to increase their security protocols. What do you need from us? What can Canadians be doing right now to lobby our government to deal with the fact that the CBC puts out memos to say don't call Hamas terrorists, call them freedom fighters or militants? What does the average person in this room need to do?
So in many respects, Canada is at the front lines of some of the emerging battles here. In my not infrequent trips to Toronto now, I've learned about this invention of anti-Palestinian racism. This is about to be exported outside of Canada, mark my words. So it's up to you to defeat it here, because it is an absolutely atrocious attempt to silence truth and to promote revisionist history. I'm sitting in front of you as the granddaughter of Palestinians. My grandparents, living in the British Mandate, had identity cards issued to them that said race, Jewish, nationality, Palestinian. The concept of exclusively Arab Palestinian national identity was invented by Yasser Arafat in the 1960s. And what anti-Palestinian racism is trying to do is to silence me and my history. What do they call it? My lived experience, or that of my grandparents. And it's trying to silence the truth, the facts. The fact that there never was a state of Palestine, there never was a Palestinian territory, that the British Mandate was not a state, but was in fact the launch pad for the Jewish Yeshuv to build the state institutions that ultimately enabled it to declare independence. So if there is one thing I can ask you, it is to devote your energies to many of the issues that we've discussed today, but to include fighting back against this appalling attack on freedom of speech and freedom of expression, because undoubtedly what starts in Canada is not going to end in Canada, and that is the blueprint that will be rolled out in other places. So something that is unique to Canada and specific to Canada at this time would very much be this new invention and this assault on the truth and the reality. And what I would just highlight in relation to this is a concept that I've come across a little more recently, which was addressed in a short paper by the Louis Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under International Law, also doing wonderful work on campuses in the United States in particular, that discussed erasive anti-Semitism. This is the erasure of Judaism as a race, as a people, as a nation. The projection that Jews can only be a religion, so that the connection of the Jewish people with the land is erased, which is integral to this canard of colonialism, right? It erases the indigenous nature of the Jewish people in Judea, and it is, frankly, I believe, an assault on the Jewish people being able to self-identify in the way that, and especially Canada, wishes to allow people to do. So I see those two concepts in a way sort of mirroring each other and being somewhat linked. But I think that this is very much the heart of where this new initiative is coming from, and I would really encourage you to do your utmost to counter it.
On that note, I just want to say that there is a lot, like, it's speak to your politicians, but I think it's important for us to identify the specific things that we need to focus on. And anti-Palestinian racism is, again, one of those things where the language has been flipped on us to make us feel like we are the bad people for speaking out against this. But it's the same thing we talked about before, right? One of the million things we talked about before. But it's the same as we were talking about this legal finding, right? That if we do the work and just read things ourselves, we may come to find information we wouldn't otherwise know. And this is the same thing with APR, as I really do encourage everyone to go to read through this policy, to learn more about it. I actually also really recommend learning more about an organization called JEFA, that's working really hard in Toronto right now to combat APR, to strengthen the Jewish position in the TDSB. They need our support. The students in the TDSB need our support. Jeff is giving it to them, and I really encourage you to reach out. I want to quickly, because I know it's gotten very late very fast, but I also know that I will probably get killed if I don't take at least a couple questions from the audience, knowing how excited you guys were to meet and hear from Natasha. So Natasha, before we take a question, I'm going to say, for whoever's about to ask their question, that I really love you and I watch all your videos, and I have this question I've been wondering for weeks, on behalf of everyone who's going to speak, and I'm going to ask you to get up to ask your question in 15 seconds if you can, so we can maybe get 2 or 3 in. And I saw your hand go up first, and I've got you guys. You go ahead. And here, I'll bring you a microphone.
Hi. Thank you for coming. I wanted to ask you about, you talked about APR. So how do you think we can fight this with actually doing anti-Israeli racism? Introducing it to school, will that work, or into institution against the APR? Because there is a DEI that's the reason they're actually going through APR and allowing this to happen and infiltrating into the educational systems. So would you suggest that IR actually will help that anti-Israeli racism to actually fight the anti-Palestinian racism?
Yeah, I think it already exists in the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And one of the key aspects, and there will be people here far better qualified, I'm sure, in terms of the lay of the land in Canada than me. But one of the issues that anti-Palestinian racism presents is that it inevitably is in contradistinction to the IRA definition. So it would inevitably require IRA to be disapplied. I think it's vitally important on that kind of related subject that and this was the subject, of course, of the Monk debate, which was passed, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. You cannot get, or at least let's put it this way, that anti-Zionism is the modern subset of anti-Semitism that is supposedly the acceptable face. There are some, aspects of anti-Semitism that are not anti-Zionist, but all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. And that is a very important message to get through. To the extent that submissions need to be made to justify this, that academics can be brought in to explain it, there are people here, I'm sure, that will be able to better advise than I in terms of how to get that message across. I'm saying do everything that you can to get that message across, because this is a Rubicon, I really believe. And I think once it's passed, there will be really serious consequences for anyone seeking to speak out on these issues.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll take a couple more. I saw you here. I'm sorry, I know I can't get to everybody, and I apologize.
So this is Canada, so how about playing some offensive hockey? There's a lot of exposés and podcasts about slavery going on in Africa and the Middle East. So what about playing some offensive and having this logo, no more slavery, stop Islamism, stop Qatar, stop Iran. So basically tying slavery to Islamism, to Qatar and Iran, and having this logo widespread through social media at every protest in big signs and playing some offensive hockey.
I actually have been to a couple of hockey games now, and I love it. We don't have it where I come from, but yeah. It's a very special sport, especially when the fights break out. That for some reason, that's what I would say. I absolutely like and endorse the idea of going on the offensive, and I think that's extremely important across a range of issues. I remember relatively early on in this process, I did a podcast for trigonometry, and I mentioned the indoctrination of Palestinian kids, and neither of the presenters had come across this before. And I said, well, have a look at Palestinian Kids TV and what they put on there. And they got one of their researchers to gather information and gather footage of this. And they actually put probably a solid 5 minutes of Palestinian TV program for kids after program for kids after program for kids in the middle of this podcast, because they were absolutely gobsmacked about what they saw. So that convinced me that we need to be more proactive about getting the information about terror, incentivization to it, through the pay for slay policy, which, frankly, the international community is complicit in. Any support to the Palestinian Authority while it pays salaries to terrorists depending on how many Jews they slaughter, I'm sorry, that's complicity. And highlighting the indoctrination to terror, that in and of itself is critical in enabling people to understand what it is that we're grappling with, and slavery and the incredible harm that both Qatar and Iran are doing, not just to the Middle East, but also, I'm sure, we're seeing studies coming out about this, to our young people in academic institutions, in media. Look at what Al Jazeera is putting out. So highlighting the negative actors here across all of these areas is fundamentally important. I would absolutely endorse more offensive work to get those truths out.
Okay, so this has to be the last one, because I know that I'll also get killed if I don't let people go home soon. So we'll go here, and I'm actually going to get away from the speaker for a second. This is a surprise to Natasha, but I just thought while I was sitting in the audience that we'll have to have you back on the podcast very, very soon and make it exclusively questions from those that were here and at our other stops this week in Vancouver, Calgary, and Montreal.
With pleasure.
So we'll send... That's a good idea, right? We'll send a form out. You can submit your questions. We'll have her on the podcast. It's called Breaking the Narrative. You can find it on YouTube. And here's our final question of the night.
Natasha, I love you. I thought he was going to go down on his knee and, do the business and have a shidduch before our eyes, because you're quite charming. I'm an ad guy, and I think that we are accused of controlling the media, and we're accused of controlling the whole Megillah. But the reality is that Germany in 1933 to 45 controlled the message, and the Palestinians are controlling the message. They've hijacked a better slogan than the real thing with Coca-Cola, and when the real thing was put out in Coca-Cola, it was a universal message. What's lacking with us is a universal message. When you were attacked on the stage by Piers Brosnan, with the most sorry,
Pierce Brosnan hasn't joined in yet.
Well, he's a good Irishman. And my dad was an Irishman, so there are good Jewish Irishmen too. When he attacked you, Morgan, we have to have, every one of us have to have a response to all of that rhetoric in the same page, the same way. We should not be leading. We want Jews everywhere. I was a Jewish boy in Glasgow, and that's not an easy thing to be in the 50s and 60s. We're never going to be loved. We don't want to be loved. Stand with Israel is a noble idea, but that's not the message. Their message is, from the river to the sea, we all know it, Gaza will be free.
I think, I'm not going to be able to give you a satisfactory answer to this, I think, because this is the problem. It's very, very easy to generate these sorts of slogans when you lie. You saw it for anyone who was watching the monk debates, everything that was coming out of Mehdi Hassan's mouth. In Hebrew, or actually, I think it's a biblical saying, 1 fool throws a stone in a well, 10 wise men can't get it out, right? It takes time to be able to unpack all of these lies and these falsehoods. It's very easy to shout from the river to the sea, to join in, and to put out lies that are very difficult to pick apart. We don't have an easy fix for this, I'm afraid. People have tried, they've come up with their own slogans. Our slogans suck, frankly. So much for the conspiracy, right? But the flip side of it, and it's a longer game, I appreciate, it is a long game, but the flip side of it is that we have the ammunition. We have the facts on our side. We have the law on our side. Sometimes people ask me, how do you do this? It must be so hard. I was like, no, it's the easiest thing in the world. And no, I don't feel nervous going into these arenas because I know that I'm right. And I hope, what I can't give you is 10 points. If you deploy these, you'll win. I'm afraid, maybe life doesn't work like that. But I can tell you that if you feel in your kishkas that Israel is on the right side here, it's because you are right about it. And if you take away... I think that was applause for Israel, or your kishkas, I'm not sure, but maybe not for me.
Started with the kishkas.
But if you take away from this evening just an iota of additional confidence in that respect, I feel like my work here is done. And if in addition to that, you take away some ammunition from what we've discussed and from the podcast to follow, then I'll be absolutely delighted, because that is my mission. I'm so tremendously grateful for all of the kind words that people have said to me tonight and that I get in messages from around the world. You have no idea what it means to me. It really is the honor of my life to be in a position to do this, to have received the education and the opportunities. And I'm so grateful to my parents for sending me to some incredible schools to put me in this position and to receive that sort of feedback. But it's so much more important. Sometimes I get messages from people, they say, I listened to you, it made me think, I read into it, you've convinced me. Not many, but some. But the vast majority of people saying, thank you, I needed to hear this. You've given me ammunition, I'm making this case, I'm making these arguments, and that is what we need to build. We need to build an army to fight this eighth front. And what I will leave you with, I hope, is a note of optimism. What Israel has been able to achieve on the 7 fronts of this war in the 19 months so far is utterly remarkable. It is nothing short of miraculous. The way that Israel's young men and women have stood up, have charged forward, and have met these challenges is everything that, we talked about the 1948 generation and what they achieved. Let's talk about the 2023 generation and what we are witnessing in real time. Israel will win this war. Israel will not just survive, she will thrive, she will prosper, and ultimately we will win this eighth front too, but we're only just starting. We need to build that army. You, ladies and gentlemen, are at the center of it. Thank you so much for coming this evening. It is the start of this process. More power to you.
They love you. They love you. Okay. We have a little tradition at Stand With Us Canada events where we take a selfie at the end with everyone, and then you can all go home, I promise. But come here, Natasha. Come on this side of me because I'm a lefty.
Okay. We're going to be really big.
Yes, we are. But that's okay.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Smile. Okay. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.